Okay, let's talk about range of motion and movement around a joint. This goes back to your anatomy class, and there is a video in class for normal range of motion and movement around a joint. You guys should all become familiar with what flexion is, extension, abduction, adduction, all of the movements that our body performs. So let's just go over kind of a quick assessment of range of motion and then how to use a goniometer. Typically, when I go in to assess a client for range of motion, sorry, the dog's just gonna bark through it, just ignore him. I will ask the client, my dear sweet Chase, show me how you move your arm all the way up as high as you can to the ceiling and bring it all the way back down. And bend your elbow, come up, and bring your elbow all the way back. And push it all the way forward and bring it back. Turn your hand up. Bend your arm up, straighten it all the way down. Bend it up halfway. Turn your hand down. Turn your hand up. Can you open and close? Good. Put your fingers down, fingers up. Any pain with any of that movement? Put your arm all the way down. Bring your arm out to the side. Bend your elbow and touch the back of your head. And bring your arm forward. Good. And put it down. So that is a quick clinical snapshot of range of motion for shoulder, elbow, wrist, fingers. We did abduction, adduction, and a little external rotation, and horizontal adduction, abduction. When you want to measure and get an exact number of range of motion around a joint, you're going to use a goniometer. So we have big goniometers. I like to use these for the bigger joints, and smaller goniometers that you can use for the smaller joints around the wrist, hand, fingers. When you're using a goniometer, you want to make sure you know which arm is the stable arm and which arm is the moving arm, and where the numbers line up. You also want to know, when measuring range of motion, what normal is. So if you get a client that can only go about this far of shoulder flexion, you know normal movement for shoulder flexion is going to be all the way up. So we want to work towards that normal flexion. So let's see how to use a goniometer for shoulder flexion and extension. So for Chase, I'm going to have him move his arm all the way through flexion again and bring it all the way back down. So I know Chase has about 160, 170 degrees of shoulder flexion. Bend your elbow and bring it back. I also know that he has maybe about 45 degrees, if we look at this angle here, of shoulder extension. Come back down. So I have my finger kind of marked where that joint is moving. And then the stable arm of the goniometer, I'm going to line up with his trunk and put that axis right at that movable point. So that axis is going to stay right there. I'm going to start my goniometer at 0. I'm going to ask him to move his arm all the way up through shoulder flexion again, trying to keep that axis in line with the moving part and the stable arm along his trunk. So now, lining this up with the humerus, the movable part, he has about 165 degrees of shoulder flexion. Come back down. So let's do that one more time. We're going to line up the stable arm along the trunk. And then the movable part kind of where his shoulder is moving, and ask him to go all the way up through shoulder flexion again. Go ahead. Lining up with that humerus, about 160. I know he can go a little bit more because he just did. Oh boy, 170. And come all the way back down. For shoulder extension, same alignment with the stable arm of the goniometer and the point of movement. Although this time his elbow is moving back, so I want to make sure that that movable arm is coming back. So I'm going to ask him to bend his elbow, thumb up. I'm going to try and keep this aligned here at the axis, and then we're going to start at 0 and move your arm back, keeping that in line with the humerus. So he has about 40 degrees of elbow extension, keeping that alignment with the trunk and then the movable arm. For elbow flexion and extension, normal movement, he's got from 0, this is his starting point of 0, elbow flexion. I know that we're past that 90-degree mark, so I'm going to look to see that there's more than 90 degrees of shoulder flexion, elbow flexion, and then coming back down for elbow extension, that he can return to almost 0. There's just a slight little curve here in his elbow joint. So the stable arm, I'm moving alongside the stable body part. Bend your elbow a little bit for me. I'm going to line up that axis where that joint is moving from. Come all the way back down again. And I'm going to ask him to move through elbow flexion. So again, reading the goniometer, he has about 140 degrees of elbow flexion. And coming back down, we're going to go from 140 back down to 0, or as close as 2. And he has about, we would call that about a -15 elbow extension, or 140 to 15. That's his elbow extension. For your wrist movements are extension, flexion. Can you make a wrist go around? Circumduction, much harder to measure. And then if we look at ulnar deviation, coming off to the ulna, and radial deviation. So when you're measuring radial and ulnar deviation, again, the stable arm of the goniometer goes along the stable joint, and the movable arm goes with the movable body part. So if I'm measuring ulnar deviation, I'm going to line that up where that movement is and come all the way over and come back. So if we start at 0 here, he has about 30 degrees of ulnar deviation, and start at 0 and come back to radial deviation. He has about 20 degrees of radial deviation. For wrist flexion and extension, we have to come up like this. So if you put your goniometer on the top of his wrist there, you're not actually measuring wrist extension. The joint is moving down here. So we have to look at where the joint moves. Bring your hand up again and back down. So for this one, I'm going to use the smaller goniometer. I'm going to use the smaller goniometer on this one. And so I put the fulcrum, the axis, kind of where that wrist is moving. The stable arm is down here, and then I'm going to use this movable arm to go into wrist extension, and we have about 45 degrees of wrist extension, coming back to neutral or 0, and then putting his hand down into flexion. I'm just going to read the other side of the goniometer, and we have about 65 degrees of of wrist flexion. So those are the basic measurements of the upper extremity. I'm going to post something in class that you'll have the normal, typical range of motion that we see around each one of these joints. When you're going through your internships, your field works, and any of the assignments in this class and in the other classes where you're talking about goniometry or range of motion, start with the basics of observation. So allow somebody to move through that typical range of motion that they have for their body, so you kind of know what you're looking for. If Chase had come to me and I asked him to move his arm up and he couldn't go higher than this, then I already know I'm not going to get more than 180 degrees. I'm not even going to get 90 degrees of shoulder flexion out of him. So I have that expectation in my brain when I'm doing actual measurement of goniometers. So you have to make sure that the numbers that you're getting are making sense. That's where reading the goniometer comes in. It's so important to understand where to read the numbers on the goniometer, because I think a lot of you are getting confused on which side of the goniometer to read the numbers from. So take a look at your goniometer, watch the video that's in class. As always, email me with any questions.